Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new session in the food and culture track with Damini Ralleigh about cultural appropriation in the food media. I'm very happy to be interviewing her today because we met last year in the university. We're both studying in the Slow Food University. So I'm very happy that our courses our paths are crossing all the time. I'm going to start with a quick quote from Damini of the future of food. A food future that takes pride in the local, honors the ecological and environmental superstructures that allows our producers to thrive. A future where those who will our lands and the hands that feed us are fairly compensated for their work and world where not a single being goes hungry. So, Damini, if you do me the favor and introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah, I am Damini Ralleigh. I used to work as a journalist in India. I'm currently apprenticing with a butcher in Siena and trying to figure out ways of ethically and sustainably producing meat.
Perfect, thank you. So today I know you want to talk about more cultural appropriation because all the discussion are ongoing right now. We talked earlier about Bon Appetit, about Priya Krishna. Maybe you can take us a little bit at what's the state right now.
Okay, I think we can start with citing some recent examples, like you said, of cultural appropriation, where very, very popular chefs, persons in the media have been accused of cultural theft or of misappropriation. There was Gordon Ramsay's Lucky Cat that he positioned as an Asian in London and was completely lambasted on social media and by some restaurant critics for cultural appropriation. There was also Lucky Cricket, which was put together by celebrity food TV personality Andrew Zimmern. It was a Chinese fusion restaurant, didn't go down well with the Chinese community at all. Jamie Oliver's rice product, which he called Punchy Jerk rice, which was a microwavable rice, didn't contain many of the ingredients that are traditionally used in a Jamaican jerk marinade. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but maybe after this you can go and have a look at this video on YouTube by somebody who identifies himself as Uncle Roger, who's sort of carved at Oliver's recipe for egg fried rice. It's very tongue-in-cheek and very funny. But what is common in all of these instances, including the one that Joella alluded to earlier, which was, food magazines like Bon Appetit or BBC Good Food, have been forced to kind of reconsider and audit their recipe archives because, some of their recipes had very generic names like Asian salad or like a spicy Indian curry. And what does that even really mean?
Yeah.
And the other thing that all of these instances have in common is that, which is essentially what cultural appropriation is a person or a group of people or an organization appropriating elements of a non-dominant or marginalized or historically disadvantaged community for economic benefit. I think all of this becomes all the more problematic when people whose culinary culture is represented by members of a dominant group do not benefit. And I obviously don't just mean this economically, but they don't benefit from it at all. The social harm involved, in cases of cultural appropriation often leads to an exoticization or a fetishization of the minority culture. For example, where when you look at something like turmeric latte, right, which is haldi doodh for us, and pretty much all Indian kids have grown up with their grandmothers shoving it down their gullet. Doesn't taste very nice, but you have a lot of food bloggers sort of now getting up and saying, espousing the various benefits of it without giving any credit, without even stating where it's from. And that becomes very problematic. What's also problematic is when, these recipes are fashioned into healthier versions of the original dish. And I'm a bit sick and tired of coming across recipes where there's an Indian dish and they claim that it's healthier because it has less oil or less spices. And the problem becomes, the problem really is that it perpetuates a negative stereotype about a culture and its food. And as an Indian, it often leads me to wonder, think about it, right? Both French and Indian food avail of vegetables, meat, and saturated fats. Which one is considered more refined? And which one are you willing to shell out? There you go. Which one are you willing to shell out more money for? food essentially, right? It forms, defines, and distinguishes cultural identities. It speaks an ethnic language, and it opens a window to understand history, and is very, very deeply situated in and reflective of power structures. In its production and consumption, a reflection of the power balance of our times. And I feel a critical assessment of all of this is absolutely necessary for us to be able to detect cultural appropriation and point it out when it's necessary.
I'm wondering all the time why it's just happening right now, why it didn't happen like 10 years ago. On the other hand, we have so many ongoing discussions right now where people stand up and say and rise and say, hey, now it's a little bit too much. Now we have a voice too, and we have a saying in this too. You cannot take everything. Like we talked privately about colonialism.
Right.
You cannot take everything from us and just use it for yourself.
You can't use it for yourself. And I think that there have in spurts been, people have been critiquing it for a very, very long time. I think in social media kind of just fuels it, right? Everybody who has an opinion can put it out, and the ones that matter when on a good day, the ones that matter are the ones that get most attention. But in a hyper globalized world like ours, cultural assimilation or an exchange of food is an ongoing, and it's a constant process, and it has been historically as well, right? When you talk about colonial, it's through sort of mechanisms of trade and imperialism. So the idea of misappropriating elements of a disadvantaged community by a dominant culture is not new. And I think a very, very quick look at the colonization of foodscapes. Let's take the example of curry, because I'm Indian. Many Indian dishes today form a very integral part of modern British foodscapes, right? And in fact, several dishes were constructed to suit Anglican palates and tastes, such as like the chicken tikka masala, for example.
I wanted to say that's.
We've spoken about it lots of times. Its origin is disputed, but several food historians have backed the claim that it was created in Britain. My other big rouse is with the ubiquitous and terribly easily available curry powder. And it's found everywhere now, and most of the recipes that will ask you to use it are written by white people. As though all our curries taste the same, and you just have this one generic spice blend that we use to lend flavor to our food, which is obviously not true. And this is one of the unfortunate consequences of cultural appropriation, where an entire food culture is distilled into one monolithic entity. And it happens with curries, or even with like certain Asian recipes. Right? We spoke about the Asian salad earlier, or the Asian noodle soup, as though there's only one version of each. The word curry also, if we just look at it historically, is not essentially an Indian word. Of course, it sort of entered common parlance, and you have a mutton curry or you have a prawn curry. But in India, there's no dish called curry. Like no kid comes back home and tells their parent to give them a curry for lunch. It doesn't happen. Okay. It obviously only came into use after the British colonized India, but it was possibly a word that was constructed for the wonderful variety of gravy-based dishes that the subcontinent has to offer, and that's also how the word is used in the subcontinent now, but it's prefixed with where the dish comes from. So you could have a Goan prawn curry that comes from Goa, and then you'd say Chingri Malai curry, which comes from Bengal. What you're doing in the process is that you're giving those dishes, the people who make them, those cultures, the respect that they deserve. One can also trace the use of the word curry. I looked at some old cookbooks, and there's a British cookbook where the first time the word curry was used was called Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass, and was published in 1747. In a recipe, she asks her readers to roast coriander seeds and pound them. And there are sort of very, very specific instructions for different spice blends, as is done in India. And all of this happened till the curry powder was invented and started flooding the markets. Lizzie Collingham, in her definitive book, Curry Biography, said, let me read this, please.
Yeah, please.
The principles of Indian cooking were abandoned as curries grew in popularity. By 1784, ready-made curry powder was available, and between 1820 and 1840, the import of haldi, which is turmeric, curcuma, which is the main ingredient of the British curry powder, which lends our food this beautiful yellow, goldenish hue, increased threefold. And so came into being different curries with Indian names like Vindaloo, a Madras curry, which bore little to no resemblance to their Indian counterparts. What's also very interesting to note here is that very few Indians were involved in this boom. So our spices were desired and were traded, but the recipe compilation, the trading, the cooking was all done by the British.
Super weird if you look at it. Yeah.
Precisely, and these are also. I mean, this is a sort of a colonial example that we've taken, but we really can take this and situate it in the globalized world that we live in today as well, right? Because what this essentially does is that it forces us to ask some very important questions, which is that whose food is sold and by whom and where and how. In the hyper globalized world that we live in, which is then fueled by social media, polyglot internationalism is not just desirable, it's necessary. Why shouldn't you be able to eat something that's grown in another part of the world? But the nuances of cultural appropriation are often lost. And they're often lost because credit isn't given. They're lost because people aren't paid enough for the food that they produce. People aren't paid enough for the food that they cook. The same thing, a French dish, you're willing to shell out a certain sum of money, but the Indian's always the cheap takeaway.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, it would be so easy from the part like giving credit, of course, with paying more or giving more the stage to it. It's maybe a little bit more. It takes more steps, but just giving credit, like this is from this in person, the recipes comes from I don't know whom, or it comes directly from India, would be so easy. It's nothing that you have to put a lot of effort in it.
Absolutely not. And essentially the question is a question of ownership, no?
Yeah.
Where does it come from? Nobody's saying don't experiment with food. Nobody's saying don't eat our food. What we're saying is give credit where it's due. Be transparent about where it comes from. And we'll all be richer for it.
Yeah. Yeah, because the heritage of a recipe is so interesting and lets you experiment with it even more, lets you take a more like a deep dive into the world of this cuisine. So it would, unfortunate that it's not happening anymore. And especially, of course, with recipes from India or Asia or from the global south, more or less. Then like everybody knows that from Bavaria comes Schweinebraten, so nobody's using this. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do. But what do you think? What would be the next good steps to work on? How can we change it a little bit? What could be a solution?
I think that there is no one formula to it. I don't think this is a black and white situation. I think what it essentially is many, many, many shades of gray. So even when I was thinking about it, I was sort of thinking, okay, then what is the solution and what can we do? All elements of culture, especially when they're so delicious, can and should be exchanged. Right? But they must be adopted with a certain amount of sensitivity, disseminated respectfully. And there's, I would imagine that maybe some questions would be worth asking. For example, the person who's cooking this for me, why is this person an authority on this particular cuisine? And if they're not, who have they learned from? And are they giving credit where it's due? And is this culture whose food I'm consuming, are they benefiting from this entire process? How are they benefiting from it? I think if we just, if we use that as a starting point, we'll reach someplace good. I believe that.
I think it's also, because we're coming back to media, because there is a question why is it not been done before? Why people are not implementing the culture and the heritage from the recipe there? And somebody has to benefit it somehow, because otherwise it wouldn't work that way. So I think it's
It is more, yeah, it is more complicated. It is more complicated than that. But I also feel that you can sell something that is not your direct culinary heritage or patrimony, you know, but use people who's not, I mean, you know, use the knowledge of the people who have inherited or are custodians of that culture. You know, you completely, it's the same thing with the curry powder, for example, right? You have completely sidelined an entire group of people who could actually benefit. I'm not saying from selling curry powder, but, you know, from selling their own dishes and taking their culture to a global audience. I also think that there's, you know, we keep saying, oh, white people, white people. I think there's also stuff that people of color can do. You know, in a time when cultural appropriation is rampant, like you said, we need to be all the more clear. We need to be all the more precise. We need to be all the more eloquent about our food culture, its roots, its evolution, and keep an eye out for interpersonal and structural racism. You know, whether that happens in multicultural kitchens, whether that happens in multicultural dining rooms or in newspapers. Don't settle for blunder, more subdued versions of your food because, you know, it's catering to a white audience. Don't do that. Assert yourself and take pride in your culture.
That would have been my next question. Do you think, like, vice versa in India? How is the situation there? Do you have the feeling that they're also already the buttermilk chicken or something came back to India, and people now selling this, like, or the chicken masala, like Indian food?
Yeah, I mean, there is chicken tikka. I'm sure there's chicken. I've never ordered it, but I'm sure there's chicken tikka masala on several restaurants. But the reverse of it really doesn't have the same repercussions as cultural appropriation does, you see, because the power structures that you deal with are completely different. However, if an upper caste person, you know, got up and said, I'm going to start selling Dalit cuisine, and, you know, we're very far away from having a Dalit restaurant in the country at this point. I'd love to see one someday, and very soon. Then it would be problematic, right? Because you're not creating jobs, you're not using their knowledge, you're just taking something that you think is sexy about a culture and using it for economic benefit. And that is essentially what the problem with this whole situation is.
Because I remember you told me about your book idea, or maybe I shouldn't spoil it in the World Wide Web.
Yeah, please don't.
But maybe I can put some insights just out without spoiling. Going back to the people who really invented recipes, it's so hard to, because sometimes, like also in Italy, or for example, sometimes it's a grandmother who's cooking and then giving it to
passing down generations.
passing down to generations. But somebody took it and then put it out in the world, which is fine by me, actually, because then people can benefit from these great recipes. But as you said before, there has to be some kind of quote. This is from, I don't know.
Yeah.
From Damini
Ralleigh. Basically attribute it where it needs to be attributed, particularly when you're dealing with people who come from non-dominant cultures, because, you know, that's we need to strengthen their voices. You know, it's just something that really quite desperately is the need of the hour. And you know, this other thing also, dishes are passed down, you know, its recipes are passed down generations, and most of us have very personal, individual relationships with food. But, you know, we all must remember also is that dishes are so much more than the sum of their ingredients. They tell stories, and not just like individual stories. They tell stories of communities, of collectives. They tell stratigraphic stories, you know. And if we sort of just keep an eye out for what is the story that this dish is telling me, and who is telling that story, and who is benefiting from, who's the protagonist of this story, for example, you know, it just allows us to be a little more cautious, a little more watchful, and, you know, a little more empathetic as well.
I think that's a good point, what you said, the impact food has on building up a community or helping to keep the community together.
Yeah.
I think
it's shared history, right? It's shared culture. I eat this, you eat this, my neighbor eats this, my best friend eats this, and, you know, We come together on religious ceremonies. We eat when we're happy. We eat when we're not happy. We eat during rituals. It's so much more than the aesthetic pleasure that we get out of food when we're sitting and eating alone. It keeps societies together. It keeps people tied to one another.
I also remember that we read in university, I forgot the name, unfortunately, a book or a paper about a person who moved to USA. I think it was Italian moving to the US and then spending.
Professor Chinoto's, yeah, I don't remember the name of the paper either.
Yeah, and then they coming together because they're eating pasta together, and that reminds them of home and everything. So I think the food always has a really strong power to connect to your roots and where you're coming from, and helps to survive in other places. But on the other hand, of course, it's a pity if it's taken out of your cultural context and just made it to something else without really concerning the people who invented it.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I'm just thinking about it. Look at an immigrant's table. Is it exactly what it used to be in his or her land, where he or she comes from? I'm not so sure. I'm sure there are changes. I'm sure there are ingredients that aren't available or weren't available. There are culinary techniques that they might not have bothered to learn because there's always the mother to do it. But then what happens when they tweak their own recipes? I suppose again it's different because the power structures involved are very, very different. It becomes the politics of it completely changes.
Yeah, I really, really hope that also, I think because it's also something consumers or people who will go to restaurants or look at all these food bloggers or this cooks in the media, that they might have more awareness that maybe it's not just curry or not just one curry, it's coming from India, and also who's standing behind this, who's backstage creating all this.
Exactly. In restaurants as well, right? You say, oh, we have an inclusive staff, and your front of the house is all white, and you've got brown people washing your dishes.
It's really problematic. I really hope it's gonna change. I don't know what happened with all this Bon Appetit now, or the other food media person who now somehow strengthened their voices. But I guess it's going to be an ongoing issue now, and people are more aware.
Yeah, they are more aware, and it's very interesting because there are lots of people who are, also social media has just opened up the scene so much more, right? Because there's so many people of color who are now speaking up, who are, they don't get published at a Food 52, and Food 52 actually does have some very interesting people of color writing for them. But, say they don't find space anywhere else, they've got their Instagram, and it's just flooded with just gorgeous recipes and pictures of, so I think it's great because it's also democratized it a little bit. It's become a more level playing field. But I think what we can do is to not just say, oh, this is a brown person or person of color saying, I think we need to figure out what voices we want to strengthen and where we want to lend our support, and be very, very clear about doing that and persistent with doing that. And I think hopefully there'll be some positive change.
Hopefully, yes.
Sooner than later.
Thank you so much, Damini. I think our time is up. We're going to go to the deep dive. Now there is a link for the audience where you can click on, and then you can ask Damini some questions in the deep dive. Thank you so much, Damini, for your insight.
Thank you, Ella. It was wonderful.